rejoice, going to England. There's a side-by-side portrait of
He's
George V
definitely
and Nicholas
Nicholas
II.
II. Yeah.
They look like twins.
Yes.
And the reason being, their mothers were sisters.
Yeah.
It's the same bloodline. It's the closest possible thing.
Yes.
So you would think that George V would open up the arms and open up Windsor Castle or whatever. And well, no. Again, unfortunately, going back to George V, that's not the end of this story. He also changed his name, as you probably know. I don't know if our viewers know, but the Saxe Coburg Gotthas, which was their real German name.
Very German, yes.
They changed it to Windsor, which is...
Hello and welcome to another episode of Stand Up Historian. My name is Kurosh and I'm joined by my good friend, technologist and historian Alexey Palladin. If you have been following these past few episodes, you know that we've been talking about the relationship between Russia and the United States during the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the time frame between 1812 until the end of Civil War in the United States. Tonight, Alexey has joined me once again, and we are going to discuss some of the most exciting parts of the Russian history, American history, and where there was a collision, if you will, and in terms of decisions that American presidents made. Thank you, Alexey, for joining me once again.
Thank you very much for having me back. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Great opportunity to learn from your experience and the way you narrate these important parts of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to the now tens of thousands of viewers, which was a very pleasant surprise, Kurosh, that have tuned into the previous episodes. Thank you. Thank you for the interest in the matter. And if I can share just a little bit of the knowledge that I personally benefited from studying many other historians. And my book, America's Arch Ally, The Russian Empire's Forgotten Role in the Founding, Development, and Defense of the United States, is actually based primarily on the work of American scholars who spent decades and decades in finding all of these facts.
Yes, amazing work. I have a copy here, an official copy.
Advanced copy,
and
especially
I appreciate
for you.
Yes. I'm honored to have this one. Okay, let's begin. We are going to start with, you take over. You want to start from 1905, 1911? That part of history is just a lot of turmoil. So
very much so. Thank you, Kurosh. And again, to our viewers, we ended the previous episode in discussing the impact of the American Civil War. And of course, there was tremendous loss and destruction. Russia played a positive role in preventing Britain and France in entering that war on the side of the Confederacy. And yet the United States lost more than 600,000 people in that calamity. What we want to talk about today is another calamity that when it ended became the worst that Europe had ever seen. And that would be the Russian Civil War, where 7 to 12 million people were lost. Nobody knows for sure for a variety of reasons, and we'll get there. But first, let's focus on 1905, 1907, 1911. Russia had actually just emerged from the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, 1907. That was settled with the help of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. He was the very first U.S. president to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in making the Russians and the Japanese sit at a table and hammer out a deal in Portsmouth in the United States. One of the people that was there was a very interesting gentleman by the name of Sergei Witte. He was Minister of Finance and later Prime Minister of Russia, who back in 1905 helped Tsar Nicholas II address the issues of what is known as the First Russian Revolution. In 1905, there was actually a series of uprisings, and those of our viewers who are interested in movies and cinematography have probably seen the classic movie called Potemkin.
Potemkin, absolutely.
That's all about what was happening on the Black Sea and the uprising and such. So Sergei Witte actually recommended to the Tsar that he issue a manifesto, a proclamation, that actually helped quiet things down. Civil liberties were granted. Freedom of speech was granted. Freedom of assembly was granted. And the first version of an active parliament was established, the so-called Duma, without which no law could pass. The Duma had to weigh in. It was an interesting time. After things were settled, Vite became instrumental in rebuilding Russia because there was a lot of economic loss in that war, which, by the way, some historians called World War Zero.
Oh,
Because officially it was the Russian Empire versus the Japanese Empire. But guess who was a key ally to the Japanese? The British.
British. Yeah.
They were providing intelligence. They were providing support. They were actually blocking Russian activity. We'll leave that aside. So Sergei Vite is focused on rebuilding Russia. 1907, 8, 9, 10, 11. By 1911, it's very interesting that President Taft actually did an analysis of U.S.-American trade, and it was growing. At that point in time, in modern dollars, it was valued at about 3.5 billion.
Russian-American trade.
Russian-American trade. And it was growing substantially because the Russians continued to look to the United States as a source of great products. For example, 1/3 of all agricultural machinery used in the Russian Empire was made in the USA. And the Russians, through Vite, actually, they wanted Americans to build their factories in country, produce product in country, and also train the local labor. He used some tariffs as his approach. And the Americans did that. And Westinghouse built a massive factory in St. Petersburg. Singer, the producers of the sewing machines that revolutionized the industry, they built a plant in the city of Podolsk. Actually, my ancestors were trained on that plant to build machinery.
Wow.
We'll get to that story in a second. But to give you some perspective, in around 1912, 1913, about 650,000 of the Singer machines were sold in Russia. 500,000 were made actually in country.
If I may interject here, you said sewing machine in Russia. It reminded me that scene in Fiddler on the Roof when the son-in-law gets his sewing machine.
It was a Singer. Yes, exactly. That was the time.
That was the time frame.
That was the time frame. That was the period of change and technological change. Americans at that point in time, so 1911, 1912, were in the oil industry. They were in the pharmaceutical industry. They were in the agricultural industry. They were in the tobacco. Everywhere you looked, American business was welcome.
Yes.
And in 1911, a squadron from the U.S. Navy arrived in St. Petersburg. Nicholas II went to the flagship, addressed the admiral, and said, "Let us raise a toast to the wonderful leader, your President Taft, and to our two nations that have never had a conflict between them in our whole history." That's where we were, historically.
That's profound.
And things continued to grow. Russians continued to import. For example, Russia was an early adopter of the Ford Model T car around the world, and things were going well, with the exception of the dark forces that were starting to brew as conflict in the center of Europe. We're not going to go into all of the detail of why World War I happened. It did. And Sergei Vite was actually much against it. Much to his detriment, he was actually moved aside, and a strong man was put in as prime minister of Russia because the hawks in the government of Russia said we must enter that war from the get-go. And Russia did, much to its detriment.
Yes.
By 1917, and that is the year of the two revolutions, the revolution in February and then revolution in November. We're going to get to them in a second. By 1917, in just 2.5 years of conflict, Russia lost about 4 to 5 million men who came home wounded, badly wounded, at least 2 million men that were dead on the battlefields, and about 1 million deserters, outlaws that were roaming the country with some guns and some ideas about what they wanted to do.
The whole fabric of society, in fact, at this point, was torn.
Yes, and Russia also lost in just that period, 16, 17, early 18, about 700,000 people who starved to death. Even in St. Petersburg, the capital, there were long bread lines. And the situation was hopeless because the whole city by February 1917 only had 10 days worth of supply, and supply was not coming. So Alexander Kerensky, who emerged very quickly as the head of the new provisional government, he actually wrote at the time, he said, Russia was on the verge of revolution even before we went into World War I. These things accelerated. By the way, when we look at World War I, I do have to mention that, of course, Russia was in alliance with whom? With Britain and France. And on the other side, we had the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottomans, the Turks were also involved. But those were the major forces. And that brings us to a progression of blunders and backstabbing that was happening between 1917 and 1920. Unfortunately, we had a situation where the relationship with America quickly deteriorated. Why? Let's talk about the leadership. If President Taft was interested in Russia, and he actually visited Russia, it's an interesting fact. He rode on the Trans-Siberian Railway. He went and visited St. Petersburg in 1907. He was Minister of War of the United States, very good relations. Of course, Woodrow Wilson came into office in 1913, and Wilson started changing America and America's approach to the world rapidly and radically. Before that, America had traditionally adopted a position of no intervention into foreign affairs.
Monroe Doctrine.
Monroe Doctrine was protective. It was more our hemisphere, you don't intervene with us, we will not intervene with you. And that political tradition went back to President Washington and his farewell address, who very specifically asked the American nation not to get into foreign entanglements that could lead to wars, unnecessary drain on resource budget, and so on and so forth.
And Woodrow Wilson ran his campaign based on not getting involved into any European war.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the interesting turning point.
Yeah.
Because he got reelected and got back into office in March of 1917. That was a campaign slogan.
Yeah.
He kept us out of war.
Exactly. That was the campaign.
And the reason why that resonated with Americans was, of course, the foundational principles of staying out of European affairs. And also, if you looked at what was happening in World War I, it was one group of monarchies against another group of monarchies.
It was, for sure, yes.
And for common Americans, it's like those czars and emperors and exactly.
Yeah.
So there was a series of things that happened. Of course, there were very unfortunate attacks by German submarines on civilian craft, the Lusitania, the tremendous loss of life. But it was a British ship. There were Americans aboard. Britain tried to get America involved.
Excuse me. There are talks that the whole Lusitania was staged to entice United States get involved into World War I.
I do not have the facts.
Okay.
I will not comment because I try to deal in facts that I know, that I've researched. And one of the reasons I'm writing this book and ready to publish it is that I've uncovered facts from the National Archives and such that I will refer to. I will mention that the Lusitania was one of the causes of getting the American public to back involvement. Another cause was the so-called Zimmerman telegram. Do you remember that at all, Kurosh?
No.
That was an interesting piece of intelligence passed by Britain to the U.S. government, stating that the Germans had signed a contract with the Mexicans, that the Mexicans would get involved into World War. Okay, so that was, of course, adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
But the real reason how Wilson justified entering World War I was the change in Russia. February 1917, the first revolution happens. People tired of standing in the bread lines, they start storming the stores in Petrograd. The Tsar gives the command, fire at the crowds.
Yep.
The soldiers who had been beaten up by this war and were distraught by the situation, they're told to fire at their compatriots.
Yes.
Women and children who are just hungry, they want something to eat, they don't have anything. And that caused turmoil. The soldiers refused, and a positive change happened.
And this is Tsar Nikolai.
This is Tsar Nicholas II.
Yeah.
He was forced to abdicate, and he did so. He saw that there was a situation and there was no conflict or loss of life involved with his abdication. So hopefully, the world is now looking at Russia moving from a monarchy, the Romanov dynasty in the past, towards a liberal, democratic, capitalist society. The world should rejoice, right?
Of course.
Not everybody did. But Wilson used that as a condition of entry to World War I because now there's hope for transformation in Europe. Russia is leading the way. Let's go into the alliance and help the British, French, and the Russians win over the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. So that was the condition of entry into war. What followed, unfortunately, was a series of very unfortunate events, which were brought about by the Wilson administration. Now, going back to 1911, 1912, that period of business growth and prosperity actually led to Russia's peak as an empire from an economic perspective. Anybody who studied Russian history would say 1913 is the year where everything peaked. Everything was absolutely fine. And of course, the war, everything starts to collapse and fall apart. So with that peak and the hope that now Russia can just transform and pick up where they were in 1913, you would have thought that America would continue its tradition of diplomacy, of sending good ambassadors, like the John Quincy Adamses and the James Buchanans and people of that caliber. Unfortunately, not with President Wilson. A Russian newspaper at the time described the situation as cold indifference from the Wilson administration. The first two ambassadors that Wilson sent to St. Petersburg were actually rejected by the Russian court. It happens very rarely in international relations. But when an ambassador presents their credentials, that's the point where the government can either accept or say, no, bye-bye, pack your bags and off you go. They were inept. The Russians did not want to deal with people who were basically political cronies of Wilson's. Finally, in July of 1914, as the war starts, Nicholas II accepts the third candidate that Wilson sends over. And that ambassador was not a diplomat, had no diplomatic skills, knew nothing about Russia. But he was a banker from California who made political contributions to the Wilson campaign. Unfortunately, we have seen that throughout American history, that sometimes it's just a payoff, a political payoff. That person lasted for only 2 years. And when he said to the Tsar, I'm going back home, the Tsar said, so soon? What is the American government thinking? We have to establish relations. We have to work together. Unfortunately, the next person that Wilson sent, Ambassador Francis, was no better. And we're going from February of 1917 to October of 1917, that critical time when the Kerensky government is trying to balance things, deal with the bread lines, deal with the loss. The new ambassador comes in, and as a contemporary observer said, he was so inept that he could not tell the difference between a liberal socialist revolutionary and a potato. End of quote. Again, just a political appointee.
Such a crucial period of time in Russian history and the United States relationship, and then a player like this enters this game.
Yes. And nobody to warn DC of what is happening on the ground, because you rely on those eyes and ears and the contacts and everything. And somebody who was basically tuned out of the whole situation. So the situation deteriorated gradually and then rapidly. So from February, we go into July. President Wilson, actually, to his credit, reached out to Russia and said, I will support the new government. I can provide loans. We understand you're in dire straits. And he actually dangled about $450 million worth of loans. There was a condition. The ambassador said, no fight, no pay. Because what Wilson and Lloyd George and Clemenceau, of course, the British and French heads of government wanted, was Russia to continue to fight the Germans. Because
tell us why. Because we see this trend in Second World War as well. So tell us why, if you don't mind.
It is brutal. It is harsh. but it is the reality. Unfortunately, the way Russian leaders look at the men in the battlefields and Russian commanders treat them, cannon fodder.
Yeah.
They give no second thought to sending wave upon wave on encamped machine guns.
Yeah.
No second thought. It was even more brutal in the days of Stalin, but in the days of World War I, if we look at the miracle on the Marne, when Paris was almost taken over by the Germans, because when World War I started, of course, the Germans had to face the Russians on the east,
Yes.
and the British and the French on the other side. Well, the German High Command under Hindenburg, they actually had a plan of a blitzkrieg. It was the first blitzkrieg. They had a plan of, in 40 days, capture Paris. And they stopped only 25 miles from downtown Paris. Reason why? The battles of Tannenberg on the other side.
Yeah.
Russia lost 2 whole armies. 120,000 men were sacrificed. And Hindenburg had to turn around his forces because the Russians, actually, if you look at World War I, the only nation out of the alliance that actually fought battles on German soil were the Russians.
Yeah.
And the Russians sent wave upon wave many a time. Now, summer of 1917, no pay, no fight, no pay. Right?
Yeah.
That's the dangle from the Wilson government. Kerensky says, I need the money. I'm going to send the remainder of what remains from the Russian army, which is disintegrating, deserters, people who want to fight. Yeah. He grabs whatever he can, sends them to fight the Germans. Initially, some success, very rapidly, destructive loss. No morale, no will to fight. People run away. They get shot in the back. And that accelerates things for who?
Lenin.
Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov.
Ulyanov?
Yes.
I always knew Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin was his alias?
Lenin was his alias,
okay.
Named after the river Lena in Siberia, because he was exiled for a while. Now, Lenin was a devout revolutionary and a terrorist. His brother was a terrorist.
Yeah.
His brother was part of the nihilist anarchists and a movement called Narodная Воля, the People's Will, that was using the 6th anniversary of the assassination of Alexander II, who was killed in March of 1881. So in March of 1887, Lenin's older brother actually made a bomb and wanted to kill Alexander III.
Yes.
He was rounded up by the secret police, put on trial and executed. And at the age of 17, Lenin swore vengeance. So it was in his blood. It was in his
Very
soil.
Personal.
It was absolutely personal. And Lenin started reading. He read Marx, Engels, other thought leaders of the Communist International Movement.
Interestingly German.
Yes. Well, actually, remember that the Communist International, one of the main meetings was held where? In London.
In London, yes.
It's very interesting that it was allowed to be held there. But we'll leave that aside.
Sure.
Lenin is joined by another gentleman by the last name of Bronstein. We know him as Leo Trotsky.
Yeah.
And a third player who had a last name of Djugashvili, as known as Stalin, the man of steel. So Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin are the 3 main players. Trotsky, by the way, in February 1917, he finds himself in America.
Yes.
He is trying to rile up a socialist communist movement in New York City. He's out on soapboxes and he's agitating people. He hears there's a revolution happening. He jumps on the first steamship, gets to St. Petersburg to organize an armed revolt. And that is what Wilson underestimated. Because even in April of 1917, when Wilson addressed Congress and then made some other proclamations, at that point in time, he was treating Lenin and the Bolsheviks, as they were known, the communists, as something that they were not. He thought that this was another liberal democratic movement. So basically discounted the whole thing.
And would you please explain for us the meaning of Bolshevik versus Mensheviks?
Thank you. Yes. So if you look at things on how feeble the effort was in terms of the manpower that Lenin had,
Yeah.
it was actually astounding that a very few but dedicated men took over the whole of Russia. So inside of the Russian Socialist Democratic Party, by the way, we hear about social
So,
democrats
yes.
today. We're going to leave that aside, but the roots are the same.
Yeah.
It's Marxism and Leninism,
Of course, the
and
roots are the same.
there's no hiding that. So the Russian Socialist Democratic Party became fragmented into two factions. And the majority of the delegates at one point in time were known as Bolsheviki. Bolshoi means big.
Okay.
Mensheviki, the smaller
Small.
group. So
Okay.
the
Majority, minority.
the majority of the
Okay.
minority. So Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, they were part of the majority that were capable of very quickly organizing between July and October, and they held their revolution in November of 1917. What is interesting is that although the Wilson government was not in a position to respond or block, and as historians point out, that in the 2 days of the November Revolution, at a critical time, if the government of Alexander Kerensky could have been preserved, then Russia would have avoided all of the turbulence.
And the whole world.
And the whole world. Think of China and the spread
Yes.
of Marxism, Leninism, communism across the world.
South America, everywhere.
But here's an interesting thing, and another unfortunate thing. And Rosh, this is a story that comes very difficult to me, because if you think about the what ifs, which historians should probably not do, they should just talk about the facts. But one of the what ifs was, what if Kerensky could have been preserved? Unfortunately, as history documents things, it was against the interests of the British. The British were a lot more capable than the Americans in their diplomatic representation. And one of the people who was in country would go into history as General Alfred Knox. Knox was a military attaché, part spy, part influencer, who knew Russian very well. And he was on the ground, and he was actually scheming against Kerensky, because Knox was a monarchist. He was interested in the restoration of the monarchy. He was not interested in any liberal reform. Knox was so close to things that he could have potentially warned Kerensky. As he put it in his own memoirs, he saw the Winter Palace where the provisional government was sitting. He saw the deficiency in their defense as a military specialist. Yeah. He saw that the only people that were left to protect the liberal democratic government were just cadets. And those guys weren't even capable of the defense. The Cossacks had left for whatever reason. And the cadets, at a critical time, out of the 6 cannons that they had to protect the palace, they moved 4 away. So when Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin decided to take things over, it was pretty much open doors.
Cakewalk.
And Knox and the British stood by and watched. They stood by and watched. It's an interesting thing.
It is. It is. And also, the story of Nikolai II, the last Tsar of Russia, and his plea to go to England.
Yes.
You want to also touch upon that?
I will. Again, it's a very, very tragic thing and a very difficult one. And to our viewers, I apologize, because some of the details are just macabre.
Yeah.
It's just, but here's what happened. So Alexander Kerensky takes over in February. In March, it becomes apparent to Foreign Minister Milyukov that the situation is unstable. The Petrograd Soviet, with Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, is already forming. Nobody knows what the balance of power is going to be, but it is clear that the communists hate the monarchy. Lenin hates all the Tsars. They killed his brother, and we talked about that. So Milyukov appeals to the British ambassador, who sends a telegram, and Prime Minister Lloyd George responds the next day. And I've told this story, and this story rises tension with our listeners in Britain, but I would encourage them to look, and I can provide all the links, to actually the British National Archives. Thankfully, the documents are preserved. So the next day, the British ambassador gets a telegram back. Prime Minister approves. Yes, of course, we will be glad to provide asylum to the Tsar and the family. Hope, rejoice. going to England. There's a side-by-side portrait of George
Definitely.
V and Nicholas
Nicholas
II.
II. Yeah.
They look like twins.
Yes.
And the reason being, their mothers were sisters.
Yeah.
It's the same bloodline. It's the closest possible thing.
Yes.
So you would think that George V would open up the arms and open up Windsor Castle or whatever. And well, no. He was afraid. He was afraid, and he was supported by some of the political activists of the time. There was a person by the name of Will Thorne, who was one of the founders of the Labour Party, that said, oh, Tsar comes here, the Bolsheviks come here.
Yeah.
We don't want that. No. It is actually recorded that the king's private secretary went to Downing Street and first actually contacted the former prime minister and then head of the Foreign Office, and then actually contacted Lord George and gave a very clear message that the king no longer wants Nicholas and his family, which basically sealed the fate of the whole family.
It did.
That cowardice, basically, there was no other word for it, led to the tragedy that happened in July of 1918.
Yeah.
So rejection comes. We know that the Tsars and the family, they took it very harshly, of course. They were hoping, of course, to be saved. So the provisional government moves them into the heart of Siberia, closer to the Urals. Yekaterinburg is the place that is chosen, far away from Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and all those crazy guys in Petrograd. Hopefully they're safe. Unfortunately, not so. After the communists took power in November of 1917, they start to rapidly progress. And it is actually something that was happening in Siberia that makes them go mad. In the heart of Siberia, there was a very formidable military force, 70,000 Czechs and Slovaks, who were fighting on the side of the Russian Empire and all the allies against Germany. They had fought valiantly in Galicia, which is a portion of modern-day Poland and Ukraine, in the very heart of Eastern Europe. They found themselves basically semi-secluded in exile because there's something going on in Petrograd and their fate was uncertain. But because they were starting to fight their way out of the empire, and they were definitely against the Bolsheviks, they were close enough to Yekaterinburg, where the Tsar and the family were held, that Lenin gives the order, kill the Tsar. And it is done in the most brutal fashion.
Yes.
The communists showed themselves as pure evil then, and so that nobody has any doubts, they repeated that many a time. But what happened to the Tsar, to his wife, to his 5 children, including a 10-year-old handicapped boy?
Yeah.
They were shot. They were stricken by knives and bayonets. The bodies were mutilated. They used acid to remove their facial features and recognition, and threw grenades at the bodies because some were still alive. Yeah, that was a very unfortunate occurrence. Again, King George V could have done things differently.
Correct me if I'm wrong,
Yes.
but I believe Nikolai became a saint in the Russian Orthodox Church.
Yes, the modern-day Russian Orthodox Church, because of course, martyrdom.
Yes.
And how he perished, and of course, the cause and the Bolsheviks. But again, unfortunately, going back to George V, that's not the end of this story. He also changed his name. You probably know. I don't know if our viewers know, but the Saxe Coburg Gotthas, which was their real German name.
Very German, yes.
They changed it to Windsor, which is a totally made up name, named after a castle that they own. Yeah. Now, back to the British, unfortunately, and the events that are happening in the heart of Russia in the summer of 1918. Back to President Wilson and the whole situation. America is not prepared to enter World War I in the spring and summer of 1918. They still need the Russians to fight. And they try to entice the remnants of the Russian military. Tsar is dead, but there are factions known as the Whites. Lenin, Reds, and the Whites are trying to mount a certain opposition. So at that time frame, Britain and France propose an alliance. Russians know it as the Entente. Entente. Uh, President Wilson considers things, and many in the United States say don't do it. One of them is Herbert Hoover, the future president of the United
President, yeah.
States. He says, look, we can justify things on the battlefronts in the heart and the center of Europe, but sending an expeditionary force into Russia, why? Wilson does that. And it is interesting that on the 11th of November of 1918, when the armistice was signed with Germany, those were the first shots of the so-called Polar Bear expedition.
Yes.
The British had deployed troops to Arkhangelsk, and they were joined by the French. That's where part of the U.S. force was sent. About 5,500 soldiers were deployed there under British command. The other part of the force was sent to Vladivostok, the other side of the Russian Empire. 8,500 soldiers under the command of General William S. Graves. And actually, if you read all of the history of that particular segment in time and what was happening, according to one historian, out of all the characters involved in the intervention against Russia, the only respectable one was General Graves. General Graves is told to go to Russia, but initially he and many others don't understand the reason why. Wilson himself, actually in his memoirs and in his diary, wrote things like, I am sweating blood over this whole Russian issue. And when Graves was sent to Vladivostok, Wilson himself wrote that I only have a shadow of a plan. It was, again, the British and the French wanting America to join.
Yeah.
There was no clarity of the reason why. The reason that was given to the public was during World War I, a lot of weapons were sent to storage in Arkhangelsk and in Vladivostok, mountains of weapons that through bureaucratic issues and such were never deployed to the Tsarist forces or to the proper troops. Now, let's send an expedition to protect that so that the Bolsheviks don't. Okay, so that's the reason.
And at this time, this is after the October or November Revolution, 1917, Russia, or still Russia, left the alliance and left the World War I. And there was a vacuum there.
Yes. And again, the alliance, Russia left in July and totally in November. And Lenin and Trotsky was a signatory, they signed the separatist Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans.
Germans, yes.
And that was something that is still very controversial in terms of the behavior of the communists, because they basically capitulated. They didn't want the Germans to fight them anymore. They knew that the British and the French were scheming to deploy their forces against the communists. So in that treaty, Trotsky and Lenin signed off on 1/3 of the whole territory of the Russian Empire. They gave up pretty much all of Ukraine. They gave up all of the Baltic states and Finland. They gave up half of the industry of Russia. They made tremendous concessions just for the Germans not to fight. And here we have the British government and the French government. And by the way, another character that emerges in this time frame, Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Secretary of War, Winston Churchill, who wants the fighting to go on. Now, of course, Churchill was very concerned with the spread of communism, with all the good reasons.
Yes.
And he wanted to fight communists and basically use an opportunity to squash. But at the same time, the difference between the French and the British and Woodrow Wilson's American position was that the British actually wanted to restore monarchy
in Russia.
So here's what happens. General Graves, who, by the way, when he got his marching orders from Secretary of War Baker looked him in the eye and said, well, here's the semblance of a plan from our president. And, quote, be careful where you step. You will be walking on eggs loaded with dynamite. Because when Graves landed in Vladivostok, he was told that there would be a fourth player in this whole thing, Japan.
Japan, of course.
And Graves had about 8,500 men. The Japanese were supposed to send 7,000 men. They sent 70,000 because, of course, they were not satisfied with the conditions of the settlement by
Yes.
President Roosevelt
1905.
of 1905, 1907. They thought, okay, Trans-Siberian Railroad,
Here's an opportunity,
Manchuria,
yes.
everything Vladivostok.
Yeah.
And to make it evident to Graves, who was in shock, and his intelligence officer was saying, well, there's a lot more of them. Japanese came and started using their own currency. They even brought their own brothels, their war wives with them. They were there as a true occupational force. Now, Graves, he had the orders to support the Czechs and the Slovaks. And the reason why he was so hated by the likes of Winston Churchill and Alfred Knox, we're going to come back to that general in a second, and the Japanese, was Graves did not want to do anything against the Russians. His mission was just to extricate the Czechs and the Slovaks. By the way, the Czech force was critical because at that point in time, those 70,000 men, who were actually very liberal minded, it is very clear in their own memoirs and how they saw things in Russia. They didn't want any restoration of the monarchy. They were actually hoping that a democratic government would evolve.
These are the whites.
These are the Czechs and the Slovaks. Yes, those guys who were stuck in the heart of Siberia. They're critical to the story because they were controlling a stretch of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And to our viewers, if you want to look at the map, from Vladivostok to the Volga, that's probably about 7,000 kilometers. That's a huge,
yes.
And they were a fighting force that was going up to 200 kilometers away from the railroad and attacking whoever. They were basically of the mindset of, let's just stop this whole civil war. They did not want any fighting to happen. Their headquarters in October of 1918 happened to be in the city of Omsk. And that is critical to our story. Because at that point in time, the city of Omsk was also the place where the all-Russian provisional government was stationed. Now, Alexander Kerensky was no longer a part of the picture, because back to November of 1917, he was in the Winter Palace. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin attacked the Winter Palace. He escapes. The communists used to tell that story for years, that he ran away in women's clothing. That was not so, but he did get asylum in America. We'll come back to Kerensky. So he's out of the picture. These are other people, liberal-minded people, Democrats. They want to take forth what happened in February and actually create a democratic country. But that is not to British liking. And Alfred Knox reemerges in Omsk, and he supports the coup that happens in October of 1918. So what happens in November of 1918 in Omsk? A coup. Admiral Kolchak is installed by the British. British soldiers are in town. General Graves looks at the whole situation and goes, what is going on? Kolchak was a monarchist. He was part of that effort to restore the monarchy. And actually, records exist where even Winston Churchill, he speaks about it openly in sessions of parliament and such. He says, as we brought the Kolchak government into power, it is now our duty to support him. Kolchak announces himself as the military dictator, supreme ruler of all of Russia, and he surrounds himself with the most brutal men. His generals were responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. Of who? All of the poor people, all of the peasants who were caught up in the middle of this war. The war that led to 7 to 12 million Russians being killed ultimately in this thing. And this brings us to a couple of quotes that I would like to share with our audience, because it's one thing, this talking head that read a few books, people who were in the arena, who were part of this effort. In December of 1918, it's very interesting, Republican Senator Johnson of California made an impassioned speech in the U.S. Congress. He said, "What is the policy of our nation towards Russia? I do not know our policy, and I know of no other man who knows our policy. I warn you of the policy which God forbid this nation ever should enter upon, of endeavoring to impose by military force upon the various peoples of the earth the kind of government we desire for them and they do not desire for themselves. The
Wow.
senator had a resolution calling for the full withdrawal of U.S. troops from all this calamity in Russia, lost by one vote. Guess who cast that vote? Wilson's vice president.
Oh.
Tiebreaker. What happened as a consequence was captured by U.S. Army Chief of Staff Peyton March, who stated, "It is self-evident that in an enormous territory like Siberia, then populated by armed bands of Cossacks, bandits, Czechs, German and Austrian prisoners of war, Russians for and against their own provincial governments, and with all law and order gone with the Tsarist debacle, the sending of a little handful of men like our expedition was a military crime."
Oh.
It wasn't just the Americans who saw it that way. Bruce Lockhart, who was a British spy, actually one of the prototypes for James Bond. Ian Fleming knew him very well.
Oh, okay.
Remember Diamonds Are Forever?
Yes.
Lockhart actually got shipments of millions of dollars worth of diamonds from the British government to bribe and scheme as part of the whole revolution and what was going on. But still, he found it in itself to write in his memoirs about the Allied intervention. It was a blunder. It raised hopes which could not be fulfilled. It intensified the civil war and sent tens of thousands of Russians to their deaths. Indirectly, it was responsible for the Red Terror. Its direct effect was to provide the Bolsheviks with a cheap victory, to give them new confidence, and to galvanize them in a strong and ruthless organism. And last but not least, George F. Kennan, who was considered one of the most preeminent American experts in all things Russian, wrote, "Until I read the accounts of what transpired during these episodes, I never fully realized the reasons for the contempt and resentment born by the early Bolsheviks toward the Western powers. Never, surely, have countries contrived to show themselves so much at their worst as did the Allies in Russia from 1917 to 1920. Among other things, their efforts served everywhere to compromise the enemies of the Bolsheviki and to strengthen the communists themselves. So important was this factor that I think it may well be questioned whether Bolshevism would ever have prevailed throughout Russia had the Western governments not aided its progress to power by this ill-conceived interference."
Ill-conceived interference. To the offense of President Woodrow Wilson, some say his intentions were good by sending this expedition forces. But listening to this reminded me of the saying, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions."
And just one more thing, if
Please.
I may, just to end this story. Of course, World War I ends with the Treaty of Versailles.
Yes.
The Paris Peace Conference that lasts a couple of years, back and forth, and British Prime Minister is there, and the French one, and of course Woodrow Wilson. What American contemporaries and historians write about Wilson was that he had a one-track mind, and Russia was not part of his consideration. And the treaty that was aimed to end all wars actually paved the way to World War II.
Yes.
Because the two nations that were treated the worst in Paris, Germany, Russia. Hitler, Stalin. Emerging very soon.
And there is no debate over that this was the first and most important mistake that caused the second. I think we should continue this in our next episode, especially focusing more on President Woodrow Wilson and the rise of Bolshevism and all unfortunate events that followed for 80 years.
Actually, yes. We just talked about, in essence, in a few episodes, 140 years of friendship.
So far, yes.
And then followed by 70 years of antagonism for the reasons of who came to power and how they came to power. First, if I may, just one little thing as a bookend. 1970, since we were talking about sort of the future and the evolution. the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and all the communist nations celebrate the 100th birthday of Vladimir Lenin. They praise him as our leader and glorious and all that. That same year, a British journalist found an old man who was dying. A few weeks later, he would pass, and interviewed him and asked Alexander Kerensky, who was still alive, a simple question. Mr. Prime Minister, you had the power to arrest or even kill Lenin. Why didn't you do it in 1917?
Yeah.
You know what he said? I didn't take him seriously.
Thank you very much, Alexey. This was wonderful. And thank you all for watching. We will continue this in our next episode. Until then, God bless you all. Take care.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.